Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about Venus-Jupiter conjunctions and specifically doing a recap of the Venus-Jupiter conjunction that just took place over the past week in the sign of Cancer, in the tropical sign of Cancer. And I'm going to be interviewing some people about how that manifested in their lives based on which house the conjunction fell in their birth chart. All right. Yeah, it's been an interesting few weeks. Venus and Jupiter moved into a sign-based conjunction, or what I call a copresence, starting on May 18th, when Venus moved into Cancer and joined up with Jupiter, who's already been in that sign for about a year now. And it created a unique conjunction between the two benefic planets, the two ancient, most positive planets that are usually associated with positive things. So the co-presence started on May 18th, but then it culminated on June 9th when the two planets formed an exact conjunction in the sky around 24, 25 degrees of Cancer. And then as of today is June 13th, 2026, Venus has now moved into Leo. So the sign-based conjunction between those two planets has now not just begun to separate, but the sign-based conjunction has fully broken at this point, and now they're moving their own separate ways. So now that it's sort of like coming to an end, I thought it would be a good time to recap and to note and to actually collect some individual stories to see how this conjunction manifested in different positive ways in the lives of people as well as in the lives of some celebrities. So I've been tracking some celebrity examples over the past few weeks, ever since Venus moved into Cancer, and there've been some really notable ones that really stood out to me that I want to share first. And then in the first, I don't know, 10 or 15 or 20 minutes of this episode. And then in the rest of it, I have a group of students of my Hellenistic astrology course, as well as patrons of the Astrology Podcast that are joining me today. And I'm going to do some interviews with individuals to actually hear directly what their subjective experience of this conjunction was in terms of where it fell in their chart. All right, so let's jump into it. So I have a hook for this episode. I was thinking of doing like a little 3 minute video I may do, but the hook for this is, what do Elon Musk, Steven Spielberg, Hunter Biden, and Vincent van Gogh all have in common? And the answer is that all four of those people were born with Cancer rising, and all four of them just had the Venus-Jupiter conjunction go exact in their first house or in their rising sign, their first whole sign house, and all of them came into greater prominence in the news recently in different ways that sort of matches up with their birth chart. And yet the timing of it, because all of them have Cancer rising, really happened to coincide with that Venus-Jupiter conjunction, that highly auspicious Venus-Jupiter conjunction in their birth charts. So, um, I had noted already, I think in the last forecast episode, that um, I saw that Elon Musk was going to he was going to make his company SpaceX public so that people could buy stocks by doing an IPO that went public on June 12th. And the same day on June 12th, Steven Spielberg released his new movie, Disclosure Day, to a lot of fanfare and so far success. It's only been out for what, a couple days now, but so far the box office numbers are good. But what I sort of like noted that was happening and it was very near the conjunction, but I forgot that they both had Cancer rising, which makes it a really fascinating crossover example between the two of them. So let me share some charts and I'll go through each of them just really briefly because these are all really good examples. All right, so the first one is Elon Musk. So here's Elon Musk's chart, and he was born with Cancer rising, and the Venus-Jupiter conjunction was in his first whole sign house. When his birth data became public a few years ago due to a biography that came out, one of the discussions we had at the time was what the like financial indicators were in his chart that indicated like a mega wealth. And that was the thing that happened on June 12th is I woke up and the headlines on like the Washington Post read Elon Musk becomes the first trillionaire in history. So he's now not just like the richest man in the world, but he's like one of the richest men or the richest man in history. And it happened to coincide with this Venus-Jupiter conjunction right in his rising sign. So, and it's like, regardless of what one thinks about the guy, that's now a historical moment that just coincided with this Venus-Jupiter conjunction in his rising sign for this individual. So, when his birth time came out, one of the notable the discussions was about like what are the financial indicators in his chart because they weren't immediately clear for some people. But one of the things that I pointed out at the time is that Elon Musk has the lot of fortune in the sign of Virgo. Let me actually add that to the chart so you can see it visually here. A lot of fortunes in the sign of Virgo. And the ruler of the lot of fortune is Mercury, which is in Cancer in the 11th whole sign house from the sign of fortune relative to Virgo. And in the second century astrologer Vedius Valens, he calls the 11th house from fortune or the 11th sign from fortune the place of acquisition. And he says when it's really well situated, it indicates positive indications basically for the person's finances and their ability to acquire wealth and material possessions and things like that. So with Elon, he has the ruler of the lot of fortune is Mercury, which is in Cancer, and then Mercury's in a mutual reception with the ruler of the 11th place from fortune, which is the moon, which is in Virgo in the sign of the lot of fortune itself. So I know that's getting like really technical at this stage in like this discussion, but basically he has good financial indicators relative to the lot of fortune, and that's precisely what was activated this week. It wasn't just that it was falling in his rising sign, but for him, there was this secondary overlay of really positive financial indicators based on the connection with a lot of fortune. And, he becomes the richest man in history, basically on paper. So that is our first example. And then to contrast that, so that happened on June 12th, and maybe I should show the transit charts. Let me switch to transit charts just so we can get oriented to what this conjunction looked like, especially for those that are watching this in the future, because we all remember it now because it just happened. But so here is the animated chart, and I'll back it up to show the full range of things, which is that Venus first entered into Cancer on May 18th and May 19th, thus beginning the sign-based conjunction between Venus and Jupiter. And this is the start, essentially, of the conjunction where I could see people started feeling it and the effects of the conjunction started to manifest as early as that ingress. Because as soon as it goes into that sign, it's also going into that whole sign house for everybody that has that as important. And then the conjunction built up over the next few weeks, eventually culminating in the first and early second week of June, with Venus going exact in a conjunction with Jupiter on June 9th. And there's other things that we can get into, but then Venus eventually departed today on June 13th, breaking the sign-based conjunction. Okay, so let's switch to our second example, which is Steven Spielberg, who literally the same day had a big movie come out. And here's Steven Spielberg's chart. He was born with 10 Cancer rising. So the Venus-Jupiter conjunction was a it was conjoined in his first house. His chart is interesting and unique because he was actually born with a Venus-Jupiter conjunction in his fifth house, in the fifth house of creativity, and that's also where the ruler of his ascendant is located. So this is also a recurrence transit for him because he was natally born with a Venus-Jupiter conjunction. But because he has Cancer rising, this Venus-Jupiter conjunction was more personally significant to him in releasing this big movie on this day that so far is doing very well. Um, there's like a whole separate side thing I could get into about how Steven Spielberg actually like created the whole genre of the summer blockbuster with the movie Jaws. And there's something actually kind of interesting about that. And Saturn was transiting his first house back then at the time, but I'll skip that and just say, isn't that significant in and of itself that you have um, these two notable famous people having this conjunction or having a really notable event happen on the same day, but in a completely different way depending on the situation with their birth chart. So we'll reflect on that more. Let me look at a few more examples first. So another one that happened that was kind of surprising, I think, to a lot of people and kind of weird and was a social media thing, but all of a sudden over the past month, Hunter Biden suddenly comes into the news, and he was um, President Biden's son, and he was somebody that previously struggled with addiction issues and had a lot of controversies and like trials and tribulations and other things for many years now. But all of a sudden, he like sort of took to social media and was doing all these podcast interviews over the past month. And suddenly, I was noticing people writing like op-ed pieces about Hunter Biden having this sort of like makeover in terms of his public image. And through some of the things he was doing, was changing some of the perceptions about him, both on the left as well as to some extent on the right, including doing interviews with people on the right and the left, including I think he did an interview with Candace Owens, and then he also did an interview with Gavin Newsom. So there was this interesting change in terms of the public perception in some ways of who Hunter Biden was because of some of the actions that he was taking during this time. And we don't have to get into that a lot, but it was just a striking example over the course of the past few weeks. Um, Similarly, on a lower level, as soon as Venus went into Cancer, John Travolta several weeks ago started promoting a new movie, and he sort of debuted this new look where he was wearing a different like hat, and like his styling was completely different, but it was so different and he was maintaining it from like interview to interview that people were actually writing articles about it and like commenting on his new look and his new style, and that it was some sort of like deliberate choice stylistically in terms of how he was trying to present himself. So this was again the Venus Jupiter conjunction in the first house for him, primarily being an aesthetic quality of something that he was trying to like change about his appearance, basically, which is one of the other significations of the first house. And then finally, one more example I noticed, which is this is the chart of Vincent van Gogh, and a few over the past week, there was a post on TikTok by an art historian or somebody that does some art history videos. Her name is Haley O'Delly on TikTok. And I think it was on June 6th when Venus was at 21, 22 Cancer. She posted this video that was like a short biography about Vincent van Gogh, but it was also clearing up a misconception about the issue with his ear and why his ear was severed and like what the story was behind that by giving this broad overview of his life. And what was crazy is this video went mega viral, and it currently has over 4 million views on TikTok and like 600,000 likes or something like that. So it was actually a notable moment where Vincent van Gogh's life and memory, and especially the incident that happened with his physical disfigurement, where he cut off his ear towards the end of his life, like came up again in the public consciousness. And she happened to release this video. I think it ended up being a two-part series, just as the Venus-Jupiter conjunction was happening in his rising sign, but also as it was happening very close to the actual degree of his ascendant, which is 21 Cancer. And like I said, the day I believe she released it, Venus was at either 21 or 22 degrees of Cancer. So there was something really striking about that, that it's not just, you know, people who are in the news and all over the headlines right now, such as, for example, Elon Musk on the 12th or Steven Spielberg on the 12th. But sometimes there's even people who had cancer rising that died over a century ago. But every time sometimes when their memory comes up again in notable ways, their chart continues to echo in time and to be activated in different ways. And I've always found that fascinating. And Van Gogh has always been one of my case studies for that in different ways. But this was one I didn't expect that I thought was really striking. All right. So those are some of the preliminary things. Let me talk about some other preliminary stuff. So different factors. There were several different factors that can make the conjunction more or less important. If it's falling in a prominent place in your chart, like the first house or 10th house, if Cancer is the perfected sign for the year, if Venus or Jupiter are time lords for the year based on perfections. Also, if the conjunction was closely conjoining or aspecting something important in your natal chart, especially if it was aspecting something within a degree, then it would have been much more personally important for you. If it's aspecting positive planets rather than challenging ones in the chart, um, Venus is also going to be more positive for those with night charts. Definitely got the more positive end of this spectrum. Like, for example, we saw in the case of Steven Spielberg, for example. The day chart people have already been experiencing a year-long Jupiter transit, so they've already been getting a lot of good stuff. And Venus came in and added some positive stuff on top of that. But I do think there may have been more of a decided swing for the night chart people experiencing this transit as a bit more positive. And then finally, those who took actions at this time sometimes were more successful versus those that just waited to see what happened. And the reason I'm bringing this up is like there was some social media discussion about this conjunction because of how much it got hyped up in some of the popular discourse, where I guess some pop astrologers were saying like June 9th will be like the luckiest day for everybody in the world. And that's not necessarily the case, even though it was a good alignment. Obviously, more advanced astrologers know that there's a lot of factors that go into why it might be more personally important and personally relevant for different people based on if Cancer is prominent in their chart for some reason, based on how it's hitting the natal chart, and so on and so forth. And this is something that Lisa and I also discussed in the context of electional astrology because it was a good part of the year. It was one of the better parts of the year to attempt to found or start new things, especially compared to other parts of the year where things are both have been more chaotic, like let's say around February with the start of the war in Iran, or later this year where we have the Mars Jupiter, the Mars Uranus conjunction coming up, or the Venus retrograde in Scorpio, or other things like that that are actually going to be more tumultuous than the beginning of June has been. Um, but with electional astrology, it's always 50-50, that it's 50% the electional chart itself and what's happening in the sky at that time in that seed moment. And then the other 50% is how it's hitting your natal chart. Is it hitting your natal chart well, or is it hitting your natal chart not well? And this was something I often saw was missing in those discussions because it's not part of like the more pop astrology part of that discussion. Um, so that's one thing I want to say. Another thing I wanted to say is from an electional standpoint, there was also some misconceptions because some people were saying the luckiest day was June 9th, the exact day of the conjunction. But when Lisa and I did the electional charts, we actually recommended the days prior to that because on the day of the conjunction, there was a Moon Saturn conjunction in Aries. So that day was actually experienced as a bit more of a downer compared to, let's say, the day before when the moon was still in Pisces, which was our recommended elections for the month. Um, there was also a challenge with the overcoming sign-based square from Saturn and Aries, which was sometimes bringing up tensions for a number of people between the Aries and the Cancer sectors of the chart. And that was something that we couldn't work around, and that was noted in the all of the forecasts as being one of the things you would have to deal with nonetheless is having the tension between the Aries and the Cancer sectors of the chart. So one of the things I want to do today is I want to talk about some examples where people had the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer, and it was just some purely positive thing that happened in the Cancer sector of their chart. But the other thing I'd like to talk to is get some examples of people that had something positive happen in the Cancer sector of the chart, but we're still dealing with the square from the Aries sector of the chart. And in many instances, I was seeing both of those houses being activated in unique and important ways between Cancer and Aries, where there was something good, but there's also something challenging coming up at the same time. And we saw this already last summer during the previous conjunction, where that was even more the case because we had the Venus Jupiter conjunction last summer in Cancer. But not only was Saturn and Aries at that time squaring it, but also Mars was in Libra, also squaring the conjunction. And things were even a little bit more difficult last summer compared to this one. So that's something we're going to be talking about a little bit today that we need to factor in and take into account. And then finally, the last thing is I did notice there was some modern astrologers noted that the conjunction was squaring Chiron, which was at 29 degrees of Aries, and also the newly discovered planet Eris, which is at 25 degrees of Aries, which is more closely squaring the actual Venus-Jupiter conjunction. And my position on Chiron has always been that it almost like shouldn't work, but I'm often annoyed to see that it does oftentimes despite trying to ignore it. So that's certainly a factor that we can take into account, even though I don't think people should overemphasize it necessarily, but we'll see to what extent that comes into play and if we can distinguish that against the square from Saturn. And then also another thing that happened was with the square from Eris, I did think that was notable because it's not something that I normally have paid any attention to or much attention to at all. But it was the first time that I noticed some things happen personally that made me take note of it, where I had a personal experience where the myth of Eris kind of spoke to that event. So it's something I'm interested in exploring and discussing a little bit more, and maybe we can reflect on that later towards the end once we've gone through some more examples from people today. Um, all right, but without further ado, why don't we get into some actual chart examples from some people attending so that we can get a better sense of how exactly this went and what the spectrum or the range was for different people. Hey, how's it going?
I tell you.
Great, thanks for joining me. What is your birth data?
January 26th, 1987.
All right, so here's your chart, Gemini rising, and the conjunction happened in your second house.
Yes.
All right, tell me the short version of what happened first.
Sure. I applied for a job. I just graduated with a degree in library science, and I've been working as a waitress for a couple decades now. So um, I applied for my first job in a library on May 18th, and then they actually set the date for the interview, and it was on June 9th in the morning. And then I found out the next day I got the job.
Yes, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so and you literally applied on May 18th, so that was the day that Venus
That
moved
I
in into.
that I planned. Yeah.
Okay, that you planned.
Yeah.
That you
Yeah.
planned, and then they
Yes.
set the interview, and then
Yes.
they set it for June 9th, which just happened to be the exact day of the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in your second house of money and finances and resources, and then you got the job.
Yes, I
All
did. And I
right.
didn't think I would either. I really didn't feel confident that day because they were interviewing so many people, and my interview lasted exactly 5 minutes. And as I was leaving, someone else was already walking in, and I was like, there's no way. Astrology let me down.
Right. So, um, and when did they tell you that you got it that same day?
The very next day.
Beautiful. Okay. So June on the 10th. And then, what else to ask? I mean, it's nice that that was also trining your Jupiter in the 10th house at the same time. I don't know. I can ask other questions, but what was really quickly, just to reiterate, so you had a previous job, but this is really a jump for you financially, basically, is the main thing.
Yeah, this is a step in the door for the field that I'm trying to get in. I mean, I'm trying to be an astrologer, but like if I'm going to have a day job at the same time, I'd rather be in libraries than in a restaurant. So I've been working towards this degree for a really long time, and I'll definitely make more money in the long run.
Awesome. That's brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, cool. How old are you?
39. Sorry, I had to think.
What profession are you in currently?
Fourth,
So
fourth house. Yeah.
fourth house. Okay, so it's a Mercury
Yeah.
profection year. I was just curious if that had any relevance, but yeah, I guess it's mainly just the Venus-Jupiter conjunction was in your second house, and you got a improvement in your day job and your financial situation. So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for, I could keep talking, but maybe just to go through them, that's
Yeah.
good. So thanks for sharing.
You're welcome.
All right. Bye. All right. That was great. Let me pull up the next example. Um, so that was a good example also because of just how obviously it was partially by choice, but like making that action at the beginning of the ingress and then it culminating at the exact conjunction is sometimes something you see both with shorter term transits like that, but also sometimes with longer term transits, including like a Saturn ingress where something happens at the beginning where it first moves in, but then it culminates at the exact aspect, even if the exact aspect is very late in the sign. So it's a good encapsulation of a principle that's true for a lot of transit cases. All right, so the next one was Arrie. So let me promote you to a panelist. Hey, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks.
What's your data?
Uh, September 19th, 1989.
So Sagittarius rising, Cancer is your eighth whole sign house. So
Hmm.
money, shared resources, and other things like that. What's the short version of your story?
Um, Basically, on the day of the conjunction, I had lunch with my mom, and she informed me that she had paid off her house, um, which is, as one of her only children, it's going to be like my inheritance someday. So we ended up having a conversation over that too about some of the legalese of that.
Got it. So it was a conscious, so it was both like telling you that she had paid off the house. So it's like there's no debt that you would inherit from that. But
Mhm.
instead, quite the opposite, that you would stand to inherit a sizable amount from her in terms of that at some point.
Yeah, and there's a lot of conversation too about like, oh, should it be put in a trust or what are the taxes going to be like and that stuff.
Yeah, I'm often surprised, but it's often really
Mhm.
striking because obviously it's like not every eighth house transit coincides with discussions about inheritance, but when it does happen, it's actually really striking to see it coincide with an eighth house transit. In this instance, like a very positive one, a very it sounds like very productive discussion.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. And I mean, you have a pretty good eighth house. You have Jupiter there in a day chart in Cancer in the eighth house. So it's sort of like activating something that's already relatively positively placed for you.
Yes. I
Excellent.
did think it was interesting too. This conjunction happened like sextile both my sun and moon, which are at the trine, the earth signs.
Yeah. So your sun's in
Mm.
late Virgo, so it's sextile that. And then
Mhm.
your moon's at 26 Taurus. Okay, nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is cool. So it's like all
Yeah.
flowing aspects. And then, yeah, I mean, even your Jupiter, which is at 8 Cancer, like has this nice trine from Venus at 8 degrees of Scorpio.
Hmm. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. I mean, I almost want to ask, like, were there any issues that came up? But I hesitate to like go into. It's not a given that there is,
Right.
but there's been discussion about some people experiencing more challenges. But it sounds like this was largely just a pretty positive event for you.
Well, yeah. I mean, I didn't have anything really tangible happen, but I've had a lot of like ennui and work problems and, self, who am I kind of questioning, what am I doing with my life kind of
Okay.
thing. So,
Okay. Yeah. I mean that is probably something we could dive into more, but I think I'll save it just for the sake of
yeah.
going through all the examples to that because I think sometimes recognizing like the singular positive thing. Because the other thing is you didn't, that meeting between her, it's not like you scheduled it to be on the conjunction. It just sort of like fell out that way, I assume, right?
Yeah. So I think she actually ended up paying off a house a few days before, but didn't really tell me until that meeting.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you happen to know her rising sign?
I believe she's a Libra rising.
She's a Libra rising, so that was happening in her 10th house, possibly. Okay, interesting. Cool. All right. Well, I think that I could keep asking questions,
Yeah.
and I always want
Yeah.
to keep talking about people's charts when I see a new chart, but maybe that's good for now. So thanks for sharing.
Great. Thank you.
All right. This is good. Let's keep it going. Laszlo is next.
Hello, Chris.
Hey, thanks for joining me.
No problem.
What's your birth data?
The 17th of December, 1996.
All right. So here's your chart on the left with Taurus rising, and um, so the Venus-Jupiter conjunction was in your third house. Could you reiterate what the short description was for yours?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, there's not that much to it except that basically for the entirety of Venus going through my third house, I've just been traveling to so many different places. I've been on tour with my band, and we've visited over like nearly 20 different cities, and just been meeting all of these. This has been this endless proliferation of like we've rented this van and we're just like going from place to place, being on the road and just kind of like staying in all these different places and unlocking all these different doors to all these buildings and so yeah, and I guess also I'm on the other side of the world from where I'm from, and um, it also kind of sort of coincides with a natal Jupiter opposition because I've got Jupiter in my ninth house in Capricorn. So that's kind of bringing in more of the super long distance travel because we've flown halfway across the world. But since Jupiter's been in Cancer, it's been more about the third house. So it's been like going from sort of locality to locality. And yeah, I'm in a Venus ruled perfection year, which is the sixth house, which brings in maybe another element of kind of more sixth house kind of. It's been really hard work as well because we've been like playing just this just like all we've played at this point about like 25 shows in
Hmm.
different cities in the UK and Europe. So it's kind of like yeah, third house, sixth house, ninth house, kind of lots of movement. Yeah,
Nice. Yeah, I love how that's
and what? Yeah,
bringing in the third house element of movement, but also activating your natal Jupiter, Mercury, Neptune in the ninth house, and just that it is bringing in that element where you're driving around doing all of this. So there's all the short distance movement, but also the long distance at the same time.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's not really that much more to add, to be honest, and nothing really culminated on the exact conjunction by degree on the 9th of June. It's just kind of been this uh constant running around. Yeah, but it's been a lot of fun, and it's been very very auspicious and very positive, which is kind of what you'd expect from both planets sort of being together.
Yeah, excellent. Well, yeah, having just a positive period where you'll probably look back and remember it as that time where you were traveling around in this like intense burst of activity as a fond, favorable memory. I think that'll be really, yeah, nice thinking back on it in terms of that, and it makes sense as a third house example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for sharing.
Thank you so much, Chris.
All right. Great. So now I'm going to move on to the next example, which is Karina. Hey,
Hi, Chris. Hi, everybody. My birthday,
what's your, go ahead.
January 1st, 1997 at 5:26 a.m. in Mexico City.
There we go. So Sagittarius rising. So the Venus-Jupiter conjunction fell in your eighth whole sign house.
Yes, correct. And it was opposite all of my Capricorn stellium, and also like I am during my Saturn return, so I felt all of these transits during this whole week very strongly. It was insane.
Nice. So, for the audience, can you give me a synopsis of what happened again?
Yeah, sure. So I was offered a new position at a company that I was working previously. I was offered that on Monday, and I used the electional astrology chart to sign the offer and send it. And then on the exact date of the conjunction, my director spoke to me and told me that she had a development plan for me to foresee other countries, which is really weird because in the electional chart we had Uranus in the ninth house. So that's kind of like what happened to me in some sense. Then the following week during the square, I was I got in touch with the company to see exactly what was the new position for, and then I ended up quitting the other job and staying at my current company because it was a better opportunity for me.
Okay. Um, so I'm trying to understand. So you applied to one company, you applied to a different company than the one you're working for now, but then what ended up happening is because you were considering leaving, your current company ended up making you an offer to stay that was much more financially lucrative. So you actually came out in a very good financial position.
Yeah, that's right. And also like the other job that I applied was really related to the Saturn Neptune conjunction. I even had like my first interview on that week in February, February 24th. I had that, and then I didn't hear anything from them for 2 months until Mars moved out of Aries into Taurus. And I also got this job, the job that I am at, and the one that I ended up staying at during the Virgo eclipse, that was on my MC in 2025.
Nice, nice. Cool. Yeah. I mean, this is great because one of the things I like about this is you were born just weeks after our last example, the one we just looked at by
Yeah.
Laszlo, where he was born in December of 96 and you're born January 1st of 97. So but you have different rising signs. So it's like this Venus Jupiter conjunction fell in the financial axis of your chart, activating your natal Jupiter in late Capricorn, and so you end up experiencing this as a positive financial transit. Whereas for him, that natal Jupiter placement's in his ninth house, so he was experiencing it in the houses of movement and travel, and he's experiencing it primarily as like a positive moving around and traveling type transit. So this is actually a really cool contrast in that way.
Yeah, it was insane. And also
Excellent. Well,
Mercury, opposite my sun and Mercury, natal Mercury. Yeah.
right. Nice. Perfect. Well, that's pretty brilliant. Congratulations. And I
Mhm.
mean, it's interesting because you were using the election. Did you
Yeah.
use the election to apply to the new company or did you use it for the old one?
For the new company, I signed it with that election, but then I had to use the same rising sign to stay at my new company, but I had the moon in Taurus in the eighth house, so not as good, but it is
Got
what
it.
it
Okay.
is.
Yeah, I was just curious about the interplay there between you were making an active choice to use the elections. On the one hand, it's less something that happened out of your hands in terms of that, but then it was somewhat unexpected that you ended up staying with your current company when they offered you more than you expected.
Yeah, yeah, it was wild.
Nice. Cool. All right. Well, congratulations and thanks for
Thank
sharing
you.
that.
You're welcome.
All right. Okay, so Miriam, you're going to be the next example. So I'm going to promote you to a panelist right now with your 12th house example. Hey,
Hi,
what's your birth data?
March 26th, 1979.
All right, so for those watching the video version, here's your chart that has Leo rising. And so the conjunction happened in your 12th house. What happened with this conjunction for you?
So in so I have the dates in on the 22nd of May. I got a note from my lawyer saying that Geico, who was the uninsured motorist company, was accepting the settlement number that my lawyer had proposed. And then on the 9th of June, the checks were actually deposited. So it took from basically the beginning of the transit to that day of the conjunction for the checks to clear and come through.
So you'd been in a car accident previously, and the outcome of this transit was that you ended up getting a settlement from the person that caused the car crash.
Yes, the insurance company that was like basically it's a little bit different because it's not the actual motorist that was paying out because he was uninsured. The car insurance that I have has like an uninsured motorist clause that if you're injured, they have to pay you.
Got it. Okay. When did the car accident happen?
2021, April of 2021.
Oh, wow. That's a long time ago. Do you know the date?
I want to say it was April 18th. It was, could have been the 18th, could have been the 21st. I remember it happening right around those dates, but because I have like
Yeah.
pieces of mail with those dates, but I just not exactly sure.
Yeah, I see Mars went into your 12th house just a few days later on like the 22nd, 23rd, and Saturn
Hmm.
was hovering around your descendant, opposing your ascendant, while
Mm.
actually Uranus was squaring your ascendant. What was the car accident and like how bad was it?
It was a rear end. He rear-ended me. It was it was pretty bad. Like my car. So I was actually driving my dad's car, which I feel I have a lot of eighth house like shared stuff in my life. So it's very eighth housey for me to have been driving my dad's car. Um, but so it was a very big, fancy car. And so if it had been like my personal car that I share with my husband, I probably would have had been much more badly injured because my dad's car is really good and like big. His car was like totaled, but and like, there was injury to me, but it was not anything that has required a lot of physical therapy and a lot of like injections that are not super like invasive surgery, but a long-term care program that has involved like a lot of doctor's appointments and painful injections and physical therapy and so forth.
Yeah, that's all very 12th housey in terms of like you had this negative experience involving somebody else. The tr ancient delineations of the 12th house are obviously really challenging and they can also be associated with like long-term health issues. But to have a positive transit then happen this month in the 12th house and then finally like something positive happened that came out of what was otherwise a negative event and getting paid back or getting reimbursed to some extent.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that's pretty
It
good.
was pretty wild.
That is
And
pretty wild. I mean,
the ninth house stuff I think is interesting too because I have been practicing astrology for a long time and I finally launched my website basically around the exact same time as the financial settlement came through. And I have the sun in the ninth house and Aries, and so it's like I'm kind of going pro, and it's like sextiling my 10th house. So there's just a lot, like a couple things coming to fruition in that like couple day period that have been like really life changing.
yeah, that's something that's really important that I often see that I think people don't take into account as much in transit studies as sometimes they're expecting like one thing to happen, and sometimes one thing does happen, but oftentimes when a notable transit happens, you'll sometimes see like multiple things in different parts of the life that sort of culminate around the same time. So that's a good, interesting example of that, that it doesn't always have to be just like one thing.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. And then it's like you have some good 12th house placements just in terms of having Jupiter there in a day chart and having a lot of fortune there. So that was also a notable secondary overlay just in terms of how that worked out on the exact conjunction, having the actual payment come through at that point, as well as that was a process because as you said, the initial judgment or part of that that started was on the 22nd earlier with the
Yeah.
Venus in Cancer. So that's another great example that oftentimes transits can be not just a singular event, but like a sequence of events that
Yeah.
start sometimes with the ingress and then like culminate at the exact conjunction.
Yeah. And the date of the conjunction, I think Venus was at 24 Cancer and my part of fortune's at 23. So it was like right on top of my part of fortune.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things we found in the Lot of Fortune example a couple of years ago that fortune sometimes represents circumstances that are outside of your control that happen as a result of chance or circumstance. And in that instance, like that was one of those things that just happened to you getting rear-ended by somebody, but then eventually in this positive transit, like finally having some positive thing happen of getting a good judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty wild.
Cool. All right. Well, we could talk more, but I think that's a pretty solid, good 12th house example. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
All right. Awesome. Um, let's jump into the next one, which is Margaret. Hey,
Hello.
what's your data?
Um, I was born on December 11th, 1981.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so your ascendant is actually 26 Cancer. So the exact conjunction happened pretty close to that, but otherwise the broader like sign-based transit was in your first whole sign house.
Yeah, correct.
So what's been going on? What's the synopsis?
Yeah, so the synopsis is I've been taking an SSRI for anxiety for over a decade. I started in 2011. Um, I'm not going to do the math because clearly I'm bad at that. Um, but yeah, I just had a realization this month that I'd never had really bad side effects, and then I just realized I was like, oh, this is really affecting my desire. And
Hmm.
so over the years, like doctors have kind of floated to me, like maybe you could try tapering off, you could experiment. And I've always been like, no, no, no. But like just very, very suddenly, I was just like, yes, now's the time. So yeah, which is weird.
Yeah. What was the date around when that happened or when you started coming to that realization or made the choice?
Oh, good question. Um, I don't have it off the top of my head. I was just thinking, I actually thought of this like at the last minute today because I was like, I don't think anything happened to me this month. And then I was like, oh, duh. So I'm about a week and a half into tapering off.
Okay.
So my doctor's appointment was about a week and a half ago. Um,
One, two, three. So yeah, we're probably talking around the very beginning of June, like the first few days of June.
yeah, right.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. So and then the exact conjunction would exact just a few days later when you're just like a few days into doing this, and then the conjunction would exact on your ascendant.
Yeah.
So I think that's really good just because the first house is both the mind as well as the physical body. And this is kind of like a mixture of those two things where it's like you're taking the SSRIs and some of the impact on the mind and the emotions, but then also that they have bodily side effects. And sometimes when we have first house transits, there can be things that change about our body. And when it's a more challenging transit, sometimes it can be an accident or an injury or an illness. And sometimes when it's a more positive transit, we can have positive things happen to the body. But sometimes it's in the sense of like of fixing something that you didn't know was off. And for you, it sounds like it was like coming to a realization that something was off that you didn't necessarily realize, but then taking steps to see what happens if you were to change things, basically.
Yeah, and I think that the symbolism with Venus, I think for me kind of resonated in terms of like just like desire and like sort of love related. I don't know. Anyway, but
Yeah, I mean that's literally one of the reasons I like this example is I believe desire is actually the very first signification that Vedias Valens gives for Venus when he starts listing off the significations. Like the Greek word for desire is like his very first one.
yeah, interesting. Yeah, I and I was thinking about I mean other things that were happening to me this past month didn't have to do with the first house, I guess, and just quite so literally, but like I also had this really weird thing where right around the time where I was tapering off, like about a week and a half ago, I had like four publications of poems like all at once, like which I've never had happen
Mm.
and haven't published like that many in like 8 years. So it was just like a very, I know I guess that kind of has to do with my identity, but yeah, it was just weird.
You had four publications of poems all come out at once in the past few weeks?
It's like seeds. So it's like they're all gonna come out, but like I got contacted like all within like 3 days by like three different people. Um,
Nice. That's amazing. Yeah, that's really good. I mean, that's literally one of the other like top significations of Venus in terms of poetry, so that's pretty cool.
yeah, no, I'm grateful. Yeah, but no bad side effects yet with the Celexa taper. So if you're on an SSRI, do it with a doctor's. This is my medical
Right.
caveat for your listeners and watchers, but like do it with medical supervision. I'm doing that. Um,
Definitely.
yeah, but
Yeah, that's a good proviso in terms of yeah, the pros and cons, and it can go either way, but that's like a well-known side effect of SSRIs, but
yeah,
sometimes the trade-off is worth it, and other times maybe different levels might be worth experimenting with. So, yeah,
yeah, really cool. Thank you
awesome.
so much.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries.
All right. That was great. Let me pull up the next one. So we had another first house one to complement that with Jessica.
Morning.
Hey, thanks for joining me.
You're so welcome.
What's your birth data?
14th of the 6th, 1994.
All right, here we go. Here's your chart on the left. Let me know if this looks correct, but you have Cancer rising with Mercury and Venus in the first house natally. So this is another first house conjunction. What happened?
So I decided to get my hair done for my birthday, and I didn't realize at the time, but I decided to do something really crazy different. I changed my hair color from red to a dark purple and cut it quite extremely. It was quite long, and it was a bit thin on the ends from postpartum. So I decided to give it a good chop, and it was very drastic change. I didn't expect it to look so dark. Um, and yeah, it was pretty intense. And because I was having my Mars return at the time, I was a little bit worried it was going to go badly, but it didn't, thankfully. But yeah,
What was the date that you did it?
on the 8th of June in New Zealand time.
Brilliant. Okay, there we go. So yeah, right, very close to the conjunction, and your natal Venus is at 28 degrees of Cancer, so it's pretty close to your natal Venus. And yeah, you decided to do a pretty significant makeover or change to your appearance.
Yeah, very wild change. A lot of people were quite shocked when they saw me after. Yeah, it looks good in the sun, but in the darker light, it looks quite extreme. I haven't been dark with my hair for a very long time.
Okay, I love that. Yeah, that's like my first house transits earlier this year when I grew my beard out for the first time, and I'm getting like a lot of people reacting to seeing a different appearance. And sometimes when we have a notable first house transit, that's what it's about. So that's interesting. You know, you and John Travolta was the other example I used of that, of changing something about either the physical appearance or how you look or style yourself. And in this instance, that being like a notable improvement.
Yeah, it was wild. And I also was thinking of your beard example when I went and got my hair done, and I was looking at my transits, and I saw the Mars return. And I remember you saying on the podcast that you were just appeasing, I can't remember the wording exactly, but hoping to get that first house transit out with keeping your beard growing. And
Mhm.
so I remember that day, I was like, I'm going to go for a bike ride, and I'm going to appease these Mars gods, and hopefully nothing, significant will happen for me. considering it's my malefic planet. And
Mhm.
so I did 16 kilometers on a bike. I'm new to bike riding, so that was my longest ride yet, and it worked out really, really positively. No events actually happened on that date because every Mars return that I've had so far has been horrific, actually. And this was my first one that was good.
Nice. What were some of the other things that have happened on other Mars returns that have been bad for you? I see it's like squaring your moon, the ruler of your ascendant.
Yeah, injuries. And just I've had a lot of bad things happen with ex-partners, and arguments seem to blow out on that day. Just lots of things that could be quite questionable. I have hurt myself as well quite a few times on that Mars return, even whether it's just a burn or a fall.
Nice. Okay. Well, or not nice, but nice as a theoretical example, which is that's great because it brings up something I meant to mention in this, which is that sometimes the protective function of the benefics, where they can protect or shield you or hold something back that might happen otherwise. And I think that's actually a good example of that because, like you said, you were having what is historically and what we would think traditionally would be a kind of tough transit for you of not just Mars returning to its natal position in a day chart, but also squaring your moon through that superior square, which is the ruler of your ascendant, and therefore the bodily and physical vitality things coming up as potentially tricky or dangerous, but then having a benefic transit through your first house at the same time, and that serving some protective function. And in some of the discussions about like how well the Venus Jupiter conjunction went at the beginning of this month, I think we're going to see a difference in like world events of how much the Venus Jupiter conjunction in the first week of the month was actually holding more back than we might realize compared to like later in the month when we're going to not have that and some of the other more tricky transits are going to happen and things are going to blow up again. So this is a good smaller term example that you sort of went by and had a challenging transit without major incident because you were having a highly benefic transit in the most prominent part of your chart at the same time. So that's a great learning lesson.
Well, it was quite interesting. And I do like how they're about to join my natal Venus as well. That's always fun.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great position to have. Cool. Well, thanks for sharing that example. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.
That was great. And then one more example in this section before we take another break with Delilah. Hey, thanks for joining me. What's your birth data?
March 5th, 1992.
All right, here is the chart. So we're looking at a chart with Virgo rising, and the Venus-Jupiter conjunction took place in your 11th house of friends and groups. Tell us about what happened.
Yeah. So while Saturn was in Pisces, I studied neurolinguistic programming. And so my cohort and my peers, we would get together every so often to just catch up because the course is completed. And so on the day of the conjunction, we had a Zoom meetup. And so we were all sharing what's happening with each other career-wise and things like that. And for myself, when Uranus went into Gemini, I decided to combine the things I was learning about astrology with my NLP work, neuro-linguistic programming, helping people shift their behaviors, identity, beliefs at a subconscious level. And so as I was sharing it with my peers, they were over the moon for me because they're like, you're a really great programmer. And then now you're adding in all these really cool aspects. So I got to share with them kind of like the behind the scenes. And I also have an example of that Mercury Saturn square as well, if you'd like me to share.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So within the call, we were chatting about, again, career. And they're like, Delilah, we honestly feel like you're undercharging for the amount of skill that you have and how dedicated you are to this. And so I took the courage to, you know what? Yeah, other people's resources, increase my prices on my offerings. And then that evening, when I woke up the next day, I had an influx of a couple bookings. And so I was like, wow, this is great. This was a nice kind of emotional support for what I'm doing. And then that aspect to the eighth house.
Nice. I love that. Yeah, that because that was the other part of the conjunction of the exact day was that we
Yeah.
had Mercury exactly squaring Saturn between Cancer and
Mhm.
Aries. And it's interesting that your friends like almost like sat you down to have that conversation and be like,
Yeah.
you're not charging enough for how much you're offering.
Yeah.
That's perfect. I love
Mhm.
that. Yeah, I think that's a good transition into maybe we should start looking for other examples of that, of what the challenging thing was that was coming up, but sometimes that the challenge brought something that was positive, that there was a good reconciliation of something, despite it bringing up some potential issue.
Yeah, and Mercury being my chart ruler, there's usually that tension that I have between, what I know, what I offer, and how that relates to other people and what they're willing to pay for. So it was a nice, again, having a mirror from my peers who have been in business for longer. They're alumni, whereas I had finished the course and the certification quite recently. So yeah, it was a nice day.
Yeah, and that's the positive side of like friends and groups is sometimes the people that show you support and provide advice or a different perspective or other things that ultimately end up being can be good for you in this instance, as opposed to say we were seeing with some of the Mars Saturn conjunction ones a few months ago, some people that were having like a severing or separation in their friend group. But
Yeah.
instead, in this instance, you were actually feeling supportive, and your friends and alliances were giving you helpful advice that was improving your financial situation.
Yes, and I'm also in my 11th house perfection year. And
Nice.
something that I noticed as well is it was making an aspect to Pluto. And something I shared in the Q&A was some ancestral stuff was coming up during this, feeling um, the idea of me making money in a way that my family never did with my mind versus like physical labor.
Hmm.
So that was something that was coming up around that time too.
Totally. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And that's cool you mentioning it that you're in an 11th house perfection year. So this was in your perfected house, and then that you have the ruler of the 11th house in the eighth house
Mhm.
of other people's money and shared resources. And both of those events are sort of consistent with that in terms of activating a natal placement as well as a transiting one at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And then as I was, gushing over the astrology stuff, I had said that day on, I think it was Tuesday, right? I was like, yeah, one day I would love to be on Chris Brennan's podcast talking about my work. And then here I am. So I thought that
Nice.
was very auspicious of me talking about it that day.
Yeah, absolutely. So then that becomes like another outcome of the seed moment that was laid at
Yes,
that time.
the seed moment. Yep. Thank
Perfect. I love it.
you.
Cool. Well, I think that's good. There's more stuff we could talk about,
Of
but I think
course.
that's great. Thanks for
Yeah.
that 11th house example.
Thank you.
All right. That was good. So that was the second group of charts I had picked out. So now um, we're going to take a little break while I reconfigure and look at what other examples I had written down, as well as if we can fit in any more in the other 30 minutes that we have of this. If you're really looking to take your studies of astrology to the next level, then consider signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus live webinars and Q&A sessions each month, and at the end of the course, you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. Okay, so I wrote down some that were sent in, and there were some people that weren't able to make it to the meeting, but they still sent in a synopsis. And I want to read a few of those examples really quick, as well as mention a few other examples that I observed or saw in different places. So let's do that really quickly so I can get some of those in because I think it helps to flesh out some of the different possibilities that we're looking at here. So, one of them I meant to mention, I saw the very day of the Venus Jupiter conjunction, Nintendo announced that it's going to do a remake of this video game from like 1998, which is the Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And I saw another astrologer posting about this who was super stoked about it on Threads, and I can't remember her name right now, so apology. I thought this was a brilliant one because it ties in with something that Lisa Scheim noted on the forecast, where she went back and researched and noticed the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in the early 2000s coincided in Cancer, coincided with the creation of the Hallmark Channel, which is like a very like nostalgic and about like feelings and emotions and things like that type channel, and that's the Cancer element. And in this instance with the video game remake, I thought it was really striking because it's a video game that's primarily targeted at millennials and like their nostalgia from like a big video game that they grew up with. And a lot of some portion of them were like super excited to play that again because of the Cancer nostalgia element that held in terms of their childhoods. So that was one of the things I wanted to mention in terms of how sometimes the sign of the conjunction can be relevant in adding some context to some of the things that are born at that time, or some element in this instance of like a nostalgia element. All right. One that was sent in, there was a Cancer rising, a person that sent in an example who has Cancer rising, and they said they were expecting this to be a generally positive period. And they said, I'm an actor, and the year started slowly and badly with lots of financial anxiety, along with a big pileup in Aries in my 10th house. But my year turned around when I booked a nice TV job filming in Spain. My first block of work days in a place were the 8th and 9th and 10th of June, coinciding with the exact conjunction. Filming can often be stressful, especially the first day, but everyone was super friendly, and I even had this lovely accent coach on set with me who kept saying, quote, I'm just here to be your cheerleader. Quote, I'm here to be your security blanket, which feels particularly Venus Jupiter Cancer coded. I also stayed in a really fancy hotel, probably the fanciest I've ever stayed in, with the most incredible breakfast buffet I've ever seen. It was like heaven. So I thought that was a good example, and also bringing up, some of the square in terms of the challenges he was having with the 10th house transit with Saturn going through Aries, but then having this brief period of some really positive experiences as Venus went into his rising sign and conjoined Jupiter in his first house. All right, so that was a good one. Let's see. Other ones that I noticed. I noticed there was one person that had Taurus rising and the Venus Jupiter conjunction happen in their third house, and they connected with a half sibling that they had never connected with before in their life, but they met up with that sibling for the first time and built a bond with them in person after just like corresponding lightly online for years, but never meeting up in person. So that was one example I wrote down that was sent in. Um, Another one similar to the Van Gogh example was someone who had died years ago, their who had cancer rising. Their children went and visited their grave and put flowers on it together for the first time together. And that was a moment of like remembering that person who died that had cancer rising. And so the Venus Jupiter conjunction just happened to be happening on their ascendant at that time. So very similar to the Van Gogh example, where our charts keep echoing in time as long as our memory does. And sometimes when the memory of us comes up again in some notable way at certain points in the future, our chart gets reawakened or reactivated at that time. Sometimes in this instance, we're talking about like positive people remembering people fondly or positively. In other instances, if it's a more challenging transit, it could be some negative or challenging thing where the memory of the person comes up for like a negative reason, for some reason. So yeah, there was some stuff we could get into that was happening this year with that. Like, the Christopher Columbus one was an interesting example where he was like born on a Saturn Neptune conjunction, and um like a statue of him was installed on the White House lawn recently, very close to the Saturn Neptune conjunction as a recurrence transit. So anyway, that's going to be a whole episode at some point. Similar in terms of third house examples, there was one that was sent in by a listener where Cancer is their third house, and they wrote, my brother got diagnosed with leukemia in February. We haven't spoken since March. I had to do a blood test to see if I was a donor for a possible transplant. There were all sorts of delays, but I finally got the test a couple of weeks ago when Venus was conjunct my Saturn. Then on the day of the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in my third house, I got the call to say that I was a match for my brother, and I spoke to him for the first time in 3 months to tell him. So I thought that was an amazing example of the Venus Jupiter conjunction in the third house of siblings, but then obviously some of the challenging transits, especially the ones going through Aries in the 12th house, are coming up at the same time because the context is something very difficult where the brother is could be dying, has leukemia, but the sibling is able to help them in this instance by being a donor. And I'm not clear. I wish this person was here so I could ask them about this more. If you are here, let me know in the chat, in the live chat, but I don't think they made it, to understand the circumstances of why they hadn't talked in a few months and if there was like tensions there or what exactly was going on. But at least the notion that the sibling may end up doing something positive for their other sibling or saving them is an interesting manifestation of the Venus-Jupiter conjunction happening in the third house of siblings. Another one, this is a two-part one, but I'm only going to focus on the smaller example. But there was an astrologer on Threads whose name was Jessica Loyce, who had a sixth house example where the Venus-Jupiter conjunction was in their sixth house. And I primarily wanted to focus on the second part of the one she submitted, where she said that there's this cat she says, one is a cat that's visited me 3 or 4 times in the last week and a half, where it climbed up the fire escape to sit outside my bedroom window. And that sounds like such a small example, except it's not, in the sense that sometimes when we have positive sixth house transits, there can be positive things that happen with pets or with animals. And while it's sometimes like hard to explain the significance of that sometimes to somebody like externally, especially if we're comparing events like, I don't know, Steven Spielberg releasing a movie or Elon Musk becoming like the richest man in history, sometimes paying attention to the small little positive things or the little acts of like kindness or grace or good fortune can be just as important, because sometimes little things do happen. And if you're not paying attention, you might overlook that there was a little positive thing that happened in that area of your life just because you were expecting something like huge. And I think this wasn't the entire issue, but that was a little bit of an issue I saw on social media where it was like some people were expecting. I saw somebody say like candy basically to rain from the sky on the Venus-Jupiter conjunction, and then there was disappointment when that didn't happen. But in some instances, not all instances, because some people genuinely did have difficult things happening, but in some instances, there were small acts of kindness or of positive things or good fortune that might easily be overlooked because the person wasn't paying close enough attention or looking in the right place or didn't know where to look to understand how this conjunction might manifest in their life. So, Jessica actually had a bigger positive thing happen in terms of like a video going viral and getting an unexpected donation by leaning into care and care work as part of her work as an astrologer. So there's a bigger story there, but it's really hard for me to summarize. So I think I'm going to leave it there because I liked the second part of that, especially with the little positive thing that she had with a pet friend who just suddenly like showed up in her life and became, in some ways, the manifestation of that transit. Similarly, I saw another example where somebody had the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in their eighth house, and they had been struggling seriously financially and emotionally with depression recently, and a friend gave them a gift of some money to help them get through that time in a time of need. And that ended up being the manifestation of that transit for them, was like a sudden gift, a financial gift that helped them get through a difficult time. So some of the Saturn stuff and the challenging things were still coming up, but then there was something positive that kind of like punctuated the day, at least for that person. Another person on Threads, I thought this was brilliant, named Leslie, posted that they said if astrology isn't real, then tell me why on the Venus Jupiter conjunction I was finally accepted into Raya after 5 years. So I thought that was really funny because Raya is like this super exclusive like dating app that a lot of like celebrities and other people use that you have to get like reviewed and accepted into, and I guess it's highly restrictive or something like that. And they said, or she said that she'd been waiting for like 5 years trying to get on it, and then they were just randomly accepted the day of the Venus-Jupiter conjunction. So I thought that was interesting as a seed moment, and as sometimes I think we've already seen this in one or two other instances of sometimes there can be a thing that was initiated in the past, but then the payoff just suddenly manifested randomly at this exact time of the conjunction. So we saw another example of that with like the car accident that happened back in 2021, like 5 years ago. But then suddenly 5 years later, on the exact conjunction, like getting the payout of something that you'd been waiting for or hoping for or fighting for a long time. And that's another possible scenario sometimes with these transits. Okay, so there were a few challenging ones, and I wanted to talk to a couple of people that had some challenging things happen in order to balance things out because yeah, just to see what that looks like for a few different reasons. So one of them was Gillian or Gillian. Let me promote you to a panelist.
Hi there.
Oh, hey, thanks for joining
I'm
me.
not I'm not sure what happened. Hi.
Yeah, you're good. What's your birth data?
April 14th, 1987.
All right. So the conjunction happened in your first house, but there was actually you experienced like a breakup, right?
Yes, essentially. And so, yeah, you're using whole sign. Um, yeah, it really came to a culmination on June 8th. And it was the second such conversation we had had, the first of which had occurred on May 12th, when he told me that he didn't appreciate me like validating his feelings, and that I sounded too much like a therapist, and that is my profession.
And you
So
are a therapist?
I am a psychotherapist. Yes, been practicing for 14 years.
Okay. So, what is the context? How long have you been together?
Well, what's interesting is that we went on our first date on January 9th, which is when Venus and Jupiter were exactly opposite at 20 degrees. So I found that an interesting piece.
Hmm.
Um,
On
yeah.
what day again?
January 9th was the first date. We initially met online on December 30th, but January 9th was the first date.
Got it. So the relationship itself like started on a Venus-Jupiter opposition and then it came to an end and he actually broke up with you on a Venus-Jupiter conjunction.
That's correct.
So what did he so yeah, so it sounded like things started to unravel a little bit in May, earlier in May, but then culminated. And then what did he say? He just didn't like the way that you talked with him or the manner somehow?
That's right. He said, I said, well, I'm curious as to what you would want me to do differently. And he said, try talking like a human being instead of as a therapist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
I found it interesting. Just a couple other pieces. Well, you can kind of see that this conjunction is squaring my sun, or at least, when he kind of broke up with me that Monday evening of June 8th. I love the comments right now. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's pretty tricky and not like a super nice statement to be making in general. I mean, obviously I can't judge, but yeah, that's really rough to like have that experience. So it's definitely over.
From my point of view, yeah, he said he was going to take a step back, but there's nothing for me to step back into. So we're good.
Yeah, that's kind of
I find it interesting
rough.
that it, it's a fourth house perfection year, ruled
Okay.
by Venus. So Venus is my time lord. You kind of mentioned in the introduction that like the time lord piece was something of note. I don't know if that applies here.
Yeah, so you're in a fourth house perfection year, so Venus is the Lord of the year, and then yeah, Venus is transiting through your first house at this time, and issues of like relationships are coming to the forefront, but then it ends up being a an ending, obviously, as well as a new beginning.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah, we were seeing some of this. I feel like in some of the work webinars a few months ago, where during some of the recurrence transit webinars, we were seeing sometimes people have like a Venus Jupiter conjunction in the seventh house, and that coming to the being the end of a relationship. But then there was at least a couple of instances where the loss of the relationship or them separating themselves from it ended up being the thing that opened themselves up to getting in like a better and more significant relationship not long after that. So it's interesting because it sounds like, not to be too judgmental, but he sounds like kind of a jerk, so that hopefully, this ends up being something that's like a positive event in the long term in terms of setting you up for better success, evidently, than what you had up to this point.
That's what I believe. Yes. Blessing in disguise.
So one of your reflections was that like you felt like it was activating a little bit the square between your first house and your 10th house and like your personality versus like your career because he was specifically like invoking your work as a psychotherapist.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I
Um,
feel very comfortable with both my career and, and I'm a very compassionate person. That's why people love me. And so it just kind of solidified what might seem like, tension to, it was a problem for this guy, but it's really not a problem for me.
yeah, well, it's like whatever he's looking for versus whatever you're offering or mismatched in some way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with what you're doing per se. Just for whatever reason, it didn't work out in this instance. And so you had that hard Mercury Saturn conversation about, that tied in your personality and your career on this day, and then that was the end of it.
That's right.
Cool. All right. Well, I could ask more, but I think that that's good unless is there anything else that's like relevant in terms of that? Like how hard was this? Because like I guess you've been dating for a few months, so that's definitely not pleasant, but
Yeah.
like how did you react to it?
Yeah. One thing I'll say about this, which is interesting, is that I started dating him just a few months before my mother passed. My mother died on April 19th, a few days after my birthday, and beginning my Venus Time Lord fourth house perfection year. My mother was
She
also a psychotherapist, and I can only imagine what she'd be saying right now, which has been very comforting.
she died the day of the Mars Saturn conjunction.
She did.
Wow. Okay. And
Yeah.
you're in a fourth house perfection year, so it's like that's actually the larger event that happened to you this year.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And you're born on April 14th, so you actually literally just went into the fourth house perfection years. Days before that, you switch into it, and then she passes away.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. That's
What a
heavy.
fourth, what a start to the fourth house. But here we
Yeah,
are.
absolutely. But I love that your ruler of your fourth house natally is that like exalted Venus in the ninth house, and you said that she was also a psychotherapist.
That's right. And she was a Libra rising. Yes.
Wow.
So
Okay.
Venus,
I love
very,
that.
very close here. Yes.
Yeah. So did you like consciously follow in her footsteps, or like how did that work out?
It was the result of her practicing for decades and then finding internal family systems therapy, really doing the work herself, and then us being able to have a totally different relationship after about 2013, which is when I started school as a master of social work. I was not going into psychotherapy. I was going to be a caseworker. And I was for a number of years, but it was after she was doing her work that we were able to have just a wonderful, personal relationship for the first time in many ways.
Yeah, 2013 was like Saturn in Scorpio, but it had just left Libra, so left your fourth house. I'm sure there was like some work that was happening towards the tail end of that Saturn through the fourth house transit. Did she do, just out of curiosity, like her work at like a high level, or would she say that she did a good job or like rose to a reasonable level in terms of her field?
Oh, yeah, she was a star in her field and, kind of went through all the certification with internal family systems in this case.
Hmm.
And I mean, there was a magnificent showing of people for her memorial gathering that we had on May 17th. Yeah, that was her life's work.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking about Venus as the ruler of the fourth being exalted in Pisces, and that sort of like keyword I've been exploring over the past few years for exaltation, that it can sometimes just represent planets or people that do rise to a high level in terms of their chosen field, or that do a notably good job of trying to do the best version of whatever it is that they do. So that's interesting, and that's why I was curious about that. Um, Okay, well, I think this is a good example because it's like it also shows that we have a lot of different things going on in our chart at any one time. And while the conjunction, like this conjunction, for example, coincided with a notable event of a Venusian, flavor in terms of having a breakup, we all have like other major stuff going on, and sometimes like much more important transits or other activations in our chart that are happening in any given year, so that it's not always just like one thing or one transit. And sometimes, depending on the chart, there can be much, much more important things happening. Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, thanks for sharing that example. I appreciate it. All
Thank you, Chris. Take care.
right, you too. All right, let me check the live chat. Yeah, Miriam says that was a profound example. Yeah, it was. Okay. Does anybody else have any other good examples? Let me know in the live chat of like houses that we haven't covered, of instances where it brought up a clear tension between the Cancer house and the Aries house at the same time, or other things like that that we haven't covered up to this point. I know we're getting towards the end of this, but I'm just trying to think if there's anything else we haven't covered. There was a couple people, like, for example, Monica. I wish I had caught Monica, um, that had a good example. Let me make sure. Yeah, no, she's not here. That's okay. Okay, so Lauren asks, Chris, what do you think of this Venus-Jupiter conjunction squaring Chiron as well as Eris and Aries? Is this a challenging, deep, transformative healing or something else? So, um, yeah, so I sort of alluded to this at the beginning because I had a family. It's like I don't know how much to go into, but I had like a family reunion type event that was positive, and there was like connecting with some family member that I hadn't connected with for a while, for forever. So connecting for the first time, and that was good. But then there was another family member who felt left out and felt unfairly criticized, and they kind of almost like threw a grenade in the entire family gathering, which caused a fair amount of like discord and like and chaos and stuff and everything, even though it didn't completely ruin the nice sort of family moment of the conjunction itself. And um, as I was reflecting on that, I did see some of the modern astrologers mentioning the square to Chiron as well as the square to Eris, and I thought that was striking, and at least to the extent that it's something I will pay attention to and will look into more, because I was looking up like the mythology for Eris, and I'm often hesitant to immediately jump it to the mythology as an explanatory factor. But the myth with Eris was the whole story about the apple of discord, where the synopsis is like she was a wedding, she was invited to a wedding, or there was a wedding by Pelus and Thetis, but then she was excluded from the wedding guestless, and she became spiteful about it, and she threw a golden apple into the wedding marked to the fairest into the banquet hall. And then this sparked a vanity dispute between the three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, which then spiraled out of control and led to the Trojan War. And I will say that there was an element of some simmering stuff like that was happening in the first week or so of June that was showing up in different way in world events. And on the one hand, it was clear that there's like some discord was happening, but it was being held back to a certain extent from spiraling out of control as bad as it could have been. And I think that contrast is going to be really clear over the next few weeks as things do ramp up, as some of the more difficult things come to the forefront with the the Mars-Uranus conjunction. We're going to see how much the Venus-Jupiter conjunction itself was holding back some things from being as bad as they could have been in some instances in terms of world events. But I guess the main thing I want to say is that the myth of that did kind of speak to me in terms of the personal experience that I had that weekend of something positive happening and there being a positive like union or coming together. But then at the same time, there was this other element that was causing strife and discord and sort of like chaos in terms of things. And that made me perk up because on the one hand, it could have been the Saturn element of Saturn squaring from Aries. It could have been the Chiron element of Saturn, of Chiron being at the last degree of Aries and therefore widely squaring. Or it also potentially could have been something like the fact that Eris was at 25 degrees of Aries. So technically it would have been exactly squaring the Venus-Jupiter conjunction. And um, I'm hesitant to even like float that as an idea because, for example, somebody approached me with like a really good pitch for an episode on Eris a couple of years ago. Um, and it was Rainer J. Liu, who gave an excellent talk on Eris for OPA, for the Organization for Professional Astrology, that you can find on the OPA YouTube channel if you just search for that. Um, and they had an excellent pitch, but I didn't want to do it at the time because I'm very like conscious of how the podcast influences astrologers and the astrological tradition at this point, and I didn't want to do an episode on something without first like establishing that it works or that it does something or what it means for myself, because of the potential influence of that. But then after having that experience, I did go back and watch Rayner's talk, and it was a really excellent talk. So that it's at least something I'm interested in exploring because I know, for example, for the Babylonian astrologers, like the ancient Mesopotamian astrologers, the traditional astrologers, there probably would have been some times when they saw a conjunction, like let's say a positive conjunction forming in the sky, let's say Venus Jupiter, but then occasionally it would have been good, but there would have been something off about it that they couldn't quite put their finger on. And in some of those instances, like it would have been conjunct Pluto, or it would have been closely squaring Uranus, and there would have been this unexpected, like disruptive component or something like that. And it's something that we know today would have coincided with the standard significations of some of the outer planets. And like I'm a little nervous about completely advancing that as a possible explanatory rationale, but I at least want to be open to it because it's possible that that was another instance of that in this instance where there was something additional that was throwing another element in that was showing up in some instances. And while we didn't focus on that entirely today, it's worth exploring. For the purpose of this, I primarily wanted to explore the positive manifestations that were relatively clean, of which there are many examples of, to contrast with the Mars Saturn examples from last month that we did. But it may be worth exploring more. Yeah, some of those other mechanisms, like the episode I did with Chiron, or a possible episode in the future about Eris, perhaps, to see if we can explore whether that is a factor that some astrologers might want to take into account. So I know that's somewhat vague, but I think that's as far as I'd like to go at this point in terms of at least entertaining that as a possibility. Ali says, house tension wise, Saturn sat on my natal Chiron in the fourth house in Aries. At the same time, Venus and Jupiter sat on my lot of fortune in the eighth. I had lots of symptoms befall me all at once, and I was bedridden for days. Yeah, it's like there's some people that were having extremely negative or challenging transits at the same time. And for those people, sometimes the negative stuff is going to completely outweigh or overshadow the positive things. But that was one of the things I wanted to do with this episode was emphasize what it can look like when you have a positive transit and when you can recognize what that positive thing is. Because one of the challenges with this with astrology is that the negative events tend to stand out more in our memories, and we tend to be more hyper aware of them because they coincide with sometimes very stark things that are very obvious, whereas sometimes we don't remember the good things as much. And that's why doing this episode as close as we did to the conjunction allowed us to explore some smaller examples or some things that might not show up in a person's biography. Because the other thing about this conjunction is it was very brief. Like we emphasized it because it was a nice conjunction that was happening in the midst of an otherwise pretty crazy year in mundane astrology. But this conjunction would have been much more notable if, for example, Venus had gone retrograde with Jupiter. In the recurrence transit episode that I did with Nick last November or December, it was very clear that, especially the people that had Venus Jupiter conjunctions, that it was oftentimes the Venus Jupiter conjunctions that were also a retrograde of Venus that really stood out as being some of the most important turning points in terms of a person's chronology or life. So, for example, we had that Venus retrograde in Leo conjunct Jupiter over a decade ago in the summer of 2015, and that ends up being the summer that gay marriage is legalized by the Supreme Court in the United States. So on a much larger level, like that conjunction was much more positive and significant in terms of world events, whereas this conjunction, because there was no station, sort of like came and went relatively quickly. And it did coincide with some positive events for some positive people, although it's not necessarily going to be as extended or notable per se as it could have been. Additionally, we have the square from Saturn and we have other factors in play as well. Okay. Well, I think that's good for today. I think we could have gone through more examples, but I think the ones that we did get through were pretty powerful and pretty interesting. And I think we sort of accomplished the primary goal of this webinar, which is just to recognize the way in which the Venus-Jupiter conjunction did show up in a positive way in some people's lives, especially those where it was like hitting their chart or was activated in some notable way. So maybe we can do a follow-up to talk about other examples or other ways that this manifested in like a separate webinar. But for the purpose of this, I think this is good, and it provides a nice counterpoint to, having the Mars-Saturn conjunction that went exact in April, and a nice contrast with that, so that these two webinars provide sort of like a nice comparison or a nice pairing, showing not just the exact conjunction and sometimes events coinciding with that, but also highlighting the entire period in some instances of the copresence and the sign-based conjunction between those two planets. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining me today. Thanks for, especially to those of you who shared your examples and your stories. I really appreciate it. Thanks to both the Hellenistic course students as well as the patrons of the Astrology Podcast. If you'd like to get access to these webinars, if you're watching this recording in the future, of course, then you can either sign up for my Hellenistic Astrology course at theastrologyschool.com, where I teach people how to read birth charts, going from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques. And we do a webinar like this every month where we go into examples or techniques or other things like that, or do a Q&A. And then also you can become a patron of the Astrology Podcast through my page on patreon.com. And then you get access to when I do a live recording webinar, including the month ahead forecast, but also increasingly doing some more like workshop type webinars as well, about once a month or so. All right. I think that's it. So thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and I'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you want to get access to bonus content, then become a patron through my page on Patreon, where you can get early access to new episodes, attend live recordings and webinars, access the monthly Electional Astrology Podcast, the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. Find out more at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alabarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sodlier, Berlin West, and Nikki Crawford. If you're looking for good dates to do things this year, then be sure to check out our 2026 Electional Astrology Report, which is a guide to the most fortunate dates in 2026. You can get it at theastrologypodcast.com/2026report. If you're really looking to take your studies of astrology to the next level, then consider signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus live webinars and Q&A sessions each month, and at the end of the course, you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, then check out the new consultations page on the podcast website, where I have a list of astrologers I recommend for birth chart readings and other types of consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, and you can get a 15% discount on it by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, we recommend the program called AstroGold for Mac OS, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount at their website, which is astrogold.io. And shout out to our sponsors for this episode, including the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening in Seattle and being live streamed online May 21st through the 25th, 2026. Find out more information at norwac.net. As well as the United Astrology Conference, which is happening in Chicago this year, September 3rd through the 9th, 2026. Find out more information about that at uacastrology.com.